We're thrilled to have you join us today for the third session of our five-part webinar series on digital infrastructure. We're back to continue the conversation, and the topic of today is the energy component.
Let's jump in and make a quick introduction because this is the third in a series. So I need to make sure that everyone on the call has some background as to what we discussed before. This series is focused on the digital infrastructure industry, which is an emerging industry inheriting the remnants of the ICT or the TMT industries. So the big components in this industry are three main pillars. And we covered this in the intro section or intro session, I should say, of the series. Essentially, we have three asset classes in digital infrastructure. So when people talk about digital infrastructure, they essentially mean one of three things: either the mobile towers or the fiber networks, domestic and international, or data centers. So mobile towers are very interesting from an investment point of view, and they carry a lot of value, and that's why they have been a focus of many new companies, ventures, M&A, and acquisitions and licenses. Fiber networks are, of course, very critical. We covered this in the politics piece of the discussion, and submarine cable networks in particular carry a big weight in delivering the value created within the digital ecosystem to their consumption. We all use facilities like Zoom, for example. Without submarine cables, you wouldn't be able to listen to me or hear me or see me, because wherever you are in the world, there is a cable system that carries the traffic from the Zoom platform to where you are, and from where I'm sitting to the Zoom platform. And then the critical piece or the centerpiece or the epicenter of the digital infrastructure space is data centers. This is where the bulk of the economic value creation happens. This is where all the digital value creation is centered around. And today we're going to talk a lot about data centers and their power consumption, given that today is a discussion about power. So these are the three asset classes in digital infrastructure. Today's focus will be data centers. I'm going to cover the model we're adopting for this discussion. Follows an industry model published by Infrastructure Masons, although I have adjusted the model a little bit to fit the full purpose of this discussion. So essentially, we have four pillars of discussion if we want to adequately cover digital infrastructure. You have the politics, power, the planet, and people. We already covered the politics piece in our second episode back in January. So today we're going to cover the third piece, which is power. And the next session will be around planet, which is the environmental and the sustainability aspects of digital infrastructure and the facilities. And the last part will be the people, which is the impact of digital infrastructure, the skill gaps, the training of people, and of course, inevitably, the impact of these investments, especially in AI, on what people do with their careers and so on. So that's the game plan. As I said, this is number 3. So we need to jump into the discussion about power, which is the focus of today's discussion. So please join me in this journey. Today we are talking about power. I'm an electrical engineer by trade, so I love nothing more than talk about power, but I understand that we have a mixed audience, so not everyone is comfortable about these technical aspects. So I need to invest just a couple of slides to establish some basic definitions. What is it that we're talking about, so that we can all continue in the journey with the same understanding. So this is the simplest way I can explain this discussion. Power is the rate of flow of energy. So this example is a straightforward one. You have a hose filling a bucket. So the rate of flow of the water is the power. So that's measured in watts or kilowatts. So power is a flow statement. So it's a rate of flow of energy over time. Energy itself is the water in the bucket. So when you're sort of thinking about power and energy, they are sort of two sides to the same coin, but they are not the same thing. Energy is what you start with, and then the rate of flow of that energy over a transmission line or over a particular appliance or a utility, that's the power. That's the power. This is going to make it a little bit more, hopefully, clearer. So again, this is another example. You have a bottle of wine. You're pouring yourself some wine. So the amount of wine in the bottle, that's the energy. And the rate at which you're filling the glass, that's power. So power is measured in one of two things. You can, if you go back to your high school physics classes, if you remember those, there was a unit called joule for energy, and essentially a watt is 1 joule per second. So again, you see a watt is a flow of energy per second. So watt or power is a flow statement. However, the utility grid operators, the companies to which we pay every month for our households and our office energy consumption, chose to measure energy by something called a watt hour rather than messing around with joule and so on. So watt, so 1 watt hour is 3,600 joules. You have kilowatt hours, megawatt hours, gigawatt hours, and terawatt hours. Now, it's not watt per hour, it's watt multiplied by hour. So do not say it's watt per hour, it's watt hour, simply because of how the units are set up. So now we know that power is the rate of flow of energy. Power is measured in, for the most part of this presentation, in kilowatt hours, megawatt hours, and so on. And the interesting thing that you will notice about all the information I'll share is that electric engineers do not know anything above terawatt hours. We as telecom engineers are comfortable after tera comes beta and then exa and then zeta and then iota, but electric engineers for some reason stuck at terawatt. So you will see thousands of terawatt rather than using petawatt. That's it. That's all you need to know to join us today. And you're going to hear a lot about terawatt hours and megawatt hours and so on. As an example, these are typical household appliances that you and I use in our households. And whenever you buy a box of these, there is on the box, they tell you the consumption, the power consumption of this unit. So you can tell when you are buying if this is going to be a heavy consumer of energy, is going to add dollars and cents to your energy bill or not. So this is an example, the Skinwood air fryer here, which consumes it has a power rating of 2 kilowatts. If you let this running for 3 hours, that means that you have consumed 6 kilowatt hours of energy. That means that you will pay your electrical utility operator at the end of the month the equivalent of whatever rate they charge you per kilowatt hours, but you multiplied it by 6. So that's what you need to know. And instead, in this case, we're going to be talking about servers, about GPUs, CPUs, electrical components used in data centers. We're not going to be talking about air fryers, but it's the same energy, the same principle of energy consumption. With that, let's jump into the meat of the presentation, which is the discussion about power, and hopefully we'll be able to ease ourselves into it in a manner that makes everyone interested. This is an interesting statistic. This is, again, we're talking about digital infrastructure and data centers in particular. So this infographic is an interesting one. There are 25 countries on this infographic, the largest one being the USA in terms of number of data centers, and the smallest one being Ukraine. So this does not cover every country in the world. The cutoff is at 25, the ranking of between 1 and 25, and then everything else is bundled here. So the rest of the world, this includes UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Nigeria, all the other countries in the world are this part. And the top 25 countries in terms of number of data centers are included by name in this on this infographic. I just want to extract some information for you so that you understand, the lay of the land and some basic information about the data center world. So the number one ranked in the world is USA. USA roughly has half of the data centers in the world. That essentially means that it is the prime target for all the research studies, all the intelligence, because USA is such a big market that we need to actually learn from it and copy as we develop infrastructure across the world. Number two is a bit of a surprise. Number two is Germany. So globally, the second highest number of data centers exists in Germany. Number 3 is the UK, number 4 is China, and number 5 is Canada. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the US is way ahead of everyone else in terms of the number. I told you that Germany is number 2, but look at the numbers. USA is 5,300, and Germany number 2 is 500. So it's not even close. It's not like Germany has like 3,000 or 4,000 data centers. US is such a huge market that every bit of consulting or intelligence you see online has to focus on the UAE, so USA as a priority. So that's the number. This is, by the way, March 2024. And the numbers, of course, keep changing, but the USA lead globally, make no mistake about it. Even China, by the way, is a distant fourth player in this. So that's why the USA is such a prominent figure, and that's why you see President Trump talking about data centers and AI. That's why you see everyone is concerned about this, because it's such a competitive advantage for the US in terms of their control over the digital landscape. People who have joined us in the past 2 sessions already saw this. I'm giving a treat for our new joiners. I updated this with the figures for January. So what this says is that this is the total megawatt for all the data centers in each market. So for example, in London, you see that the total power in megawatts, now you know what a megawatt is, the total power in megawatts for all the data centers in London is 996. In Beijing, it's 1,864. You can clearly see that Virginia, not the US, just Virginia, is the highest market or concentration in the world with 5,536 megawatts. That's 5.15 gigawatts. And immediately you can see how the US is such a massive force in this, because on top of Virginia, you have New York, New Jersey, you have Charlotte, you have Atlanta, Nashville, Texas, and so on. So the combination of all the markets in the US is what gives the US such a formidable force in the digital landscape. And you can immediately also see that the global south, if you will, Middle East, Africa, for the most part, we do not have enough to be ranked in this top 40 list globally. So the key point here is that everything in data centers is measured in megawatts. And our session today is about power, which is measured in megawatts. So now you understand when I said power is the most important pillar, because everything is measured in power. Everything. All the other stuff is just ancillary, it's just enabling, it's just supporting, everything is in power. I'm going to give you one more statistic about the global landscape of power. This is from Cushman & Wakefield. I want you to ignore the vertical axis. It doesn't concern us right now. What they try to do is to actually graphically represent the amount of power in each market by the diameter of the circle. So London, you see the assessment in London there. This is Frankfurt, Dublin, Amsterdam, Paris, and Milan. Because these guys are the largest, they're considered primary markets or powerhouse markets. And then you have all the other markets in EMEA ranked here. And you see familiar names. You see Johannesburg, you see Dubai, you see Abu Dhabi, you see Tel Aviv, Cape Town, and so on. Riyadh here as well in Saudi Arabia, and so on. The smallest market in this list is Istanbul. And you can tell from the horizontal axis that Istanbul total megawatt in terms of data center capacity is around 160, 170 megawatt. Anything smaller than that does not show on this map. So again, you see how the world is in a race. Everybody's trying to actually put together as much power as possible to support the digital infrastructure development plans, especially when we talk about AI. One thing I need you to make a mental note of is this FLAP-D thing. So FLAP-D stands for Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Dublin. These are considered the top 5 biggest market in EMEA or Europe. And I also need you to make a mental note about the Nordics. If you see Helsinki here, Oslo, we're going to touch on the Nordics in a couple of slides. But for now, this is how the EMEA region, of which Egypt is part of, stacks up in terms of the total megawatts for power. This is just exemplary to understand. Virginia, of course, from the last slide, we know Virginia is not 23 gigawatts, it's 5.5. But here they included all the future projects in the pipeline under development, so that when Virginia completely develops, they will have 23 gigawatts of capacity. With that, let's jump into some nice comparisons. This is interesting. The year 2020, if you remember, was the year of the COVID or the coronavirus pandemic. And this was a milestone year for data centers, because for the first time ever, we started using more and more of these platforms that are housed in data centers. We started using Zoom calls more. We started using Teams, and we're starting using online education and online entertainment like Netflix and streaming service and so on. So it makes sense to measure everything to look at 2020. And the interesting statistic here is that this is the total consumption of a country like Egypt in that year in terawatt hours. That's the total energy consumed in Egypt. And this is data centers. So you can see data centers globally, and there is a range there depending on the margin of error and the scope of data. Data centers globally in 2020 consume more energy than Indonesia or even the UK. Or comparative to South Africa or Egypt, I should say, the other way around. So the point here is that this statistic tells you that data centers are becoming more and more energy hungry, and they're becoming more and more integral to what we do, whether business, education, entertainment, whatever it is. So that statistic tells you that more and more focus is focused on the energy consumption, which is our focus today of data centers. This one is also nice, same thing. But this one is somewhat more sort of controversial, because people do not really like the fact that a company like Google, the aggregate power consumption of all the facilities of Google globally is more than the country of Jordan. So here you have the total terawatt hours consumed per country or per company, and here they have the population. And for example, Nigeria, and this is 2022 figures, consumed 32 terawatt hours in a year. Google consumes 24, Microsoft comparable, Meta, which is the owner of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, consumes 12, and Apple at the very bottom. What this tells us that if this was a country, it would consume more energy than Jordan or Iceland or Ghana or Croatia. So again, emphasizing the same point, data center consumption now is becoming a topic of international focus, and we need to be aware of that as we plan our networks and also as we plan our investments in network expansion and so on. I hope you're still with me. So what's happening right now? What's happening is a transition from an old regime of data centers into a new regime. So we're transitioning from the typical retail co-location, your sort of data center around, 2016, 2017, that's a typical data center environment, into the high performance computing and AI right now. The transition translates into more power consumption per rack. So you can see the rack here, a typical rack would consume 6 kilowatts to 12 kilowatts. Now we're moving into the AI heavy infrastructure, which uses anywhere from 50 kilowatts to 150 kilowatts. So as we migrate from the traditional retail co-location centric data center environment into these AI workhorses that you hear CEOs of OpenAI and NVIDIA talk about, the inevitable result is that we're going to need more power. We're going to need more power and also more infrastructure, as I'm going to explain in a second, within the data center specialist infrastructure. So that's what's happening, and this is the transition that all countries have to go through. We cannot escape this. So what does that mean? What does that translate into? You're going to face actually 3 design challenges as you migrate from your run-of-the-mill or plain vanilla data center into specialist AI data centers. The first one is you're going to need more power density. That means that you're going to need racks that have 120 kilowatts per rack, as opposed to the traditional racks running enterprise applications. You're also going to take into account some redesign requirements, mainly cooling. These things run extremely hot. So you need specialist cooling systems to actually cover the cooling or the heat from these AI data centers. And also you're going to need to adopt a different location strategy, which in a sense is an opportunity for emerging markets, because right now all the primary markets are saturated. So right now data centers are moving to remote markets seeking energy. So anybody who has energy is a prime target to accommodate these data centers, because the primary markets like London or Paris, Frankfurt, and all the major cities are almost saturated. They cannot find energy to run these things. So this transition is ongoing, and this provides some opportunity if you are in emerging markets like Egypt, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Kenya. You can actually play this location strategy thing and try to attract investments into your own market. I have to spend a couple of slides on this whole GPU thing, because I know we keep hearing about what NVIDIA is doing, what AMD is doing, but we need to put some context to this. So why is it that these processors consume so much power, and what can happen next, if you will? So all I need you to understand on this slide is the architectural difference between a traditional CPU. Your laptop right now, if you're watching this on a laptop or a desktop, has a CPU, probably an Intel Core i7, i5, whatever it is, or an AMD Ryzen and so on. The typical CPU architecture has multiple cores. I'm simplifying here. The ALU stands for arithmetic logic unit. So these are different cores. This is where the number crunching and the animation and the Excel calculation, everything happens here. For that, you need some control logic and some cache to copy the information from memory. So that's a typical CPU design. The number of cores is usually low. So when you go to buy a laptop, they tell you we have like 8 cores, 16 cores, whatever it is. Now, the GPU architecture, by comparison, is designed for parallel processing. So the logic there is that we need to have smaller cores, but running in parallel. And the G comes from graphics. These things were originally designed to handle graphic rendering in games. And in a typical game, when you have a scene where you have 5 light sources and you have materials like glass or gold or metal or rock, you need on-the-fly calculations so that you can see how light reflects over these materials, and you can make decisions in the game based on if you're walking on water, if you have glass in front of you, and so on. So the G comes from graphics. However, the logic is the same if you want to actually compute large language models for an AI application. So what you need to see immediately is that look how many cores are there. These are the green ones. These are the cores. And here you have a limited number of cores. So GPUs operate in parallel and they're smaller in size, but you have a massive amount of cores, thousands of cores within a GPU. And this is what NVIDIA builds or other companies. I'm going to show a couple of examples. And because of this, you're stacking so many cores in such a space, the consumption of power ramps up considerably compared to these CPUs. This is a typical example of an offering from a company called AMD. And again, they are fairly known in the processor business. And AMD manufactures both CPUs and GPUs. This particular chip is called an APU. This is their marketing term for a chip that combines a CPU and a GPU. It doesn't concern us as much. What concerns us is this one, 750 watt. I need you to imagine that this single chip consumes 750 watt. That's as much as a small water heater or a water kettle, if you will. So the power consumption becomes an issue with these things because I have a massive number of transistors and a massive number of storage and memory on this chip. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty stuff of the favorite of everyone, NVIDIA. So NVIDIA, last year's model is the Blackwell chip. And the Blackwell chip, if you can imagine this, it consumes 1.2 kilowatts of power. This is insane. Nobody could imagine this 5 years ago, that you would have a single chip that consumes so much power. And for you to understand the complexity of this Blackwell chip, it has 208 billion transistors in it. The Blackwell chip is made up of 100 plus layers. A layer of it's like a floor in a building. So if you can imagine a skyscraper of 100 floors squashed into nanometers of dimensions. So this is the Blackwell chip. Of course, back in March, they launched the Blackwell Ultra, but doesn't really concern us much here. I want to show you something that's even more scary, which is this chip. This is the GB200. So this is one Blackwell plus one Blackwell, and they have a Grace CPU. So similar to AMD having a CPU and a GPU on a card, NVIDIA is doing the same. What concerns us here is that this single building block, and this is like the 4x2 Lego, if you play by Legos, this is like the standard building block of all the infrastructure I'm going to show you. This single thing consumes 2.7 kilowatts. So just without integrating anything else, just a single card consumes 2.7 kilowatts. The next one is a very nice video. It's going to give us time to sort of slow down the presentation a little bit. This video comes from NVIDIA, and it's going to show you the entire NVIDIA AI architecture. Try not to gasp at the end, because typically when I show people this, the last 5 seconds is people gasp because they cannot believe so much power and so much infrastructure. So this is the video that I'm going to show you, and it actually starts from building the Blackwell GPU, which is the workhorse of the modern data center, and then we're going to build up from there to build massive data centers. So now I get an idea about how massive these things are. This is the NVIDIA architecture of AI data centers. And as you saw, we're starting from a single processor and then ramping up into this one. The final one is 32 GPUs. This is the stuff that Microsoft and AI and Google are buying. And you can imagine that this consumes a huge amount of energy. The numbers there are just really scary. Let me show you how scary they are. Look at this. This is a post on X by Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. He's saying that this is the NVL72, that the one you saw. This rack consumes 120 kilowatts. And he's posting on January 31st, only 2 months ago, that the first full 8-rack GB200 NVL27 now running at Azure. Now, the funny part is that as massive as this consumption is, NVIDIA in March just released something that consumes even more power. So I need you to understand that this is very recent. The OpenAI just installed these back in January, and already they're out of date. Already there is a newer model. And this number is scary. This number is really scary. 120 kilowatt per rack. Very few data centers in the world right now can deliver 120 kilowatts to a rack in terms of electrical power. So that already tells you that we're already in trouble as far as power is concerned. The next video is a very nice one, and it comes from the CEO of NVIDIA back in March 18th on their GTC conference in San Jose, California. And it's a really nice, interesting way of looking at things.
One big idea is that every single data center in the future will be power limited. Your revenues are power limited. You could figure out what your revenues are going to be based on the power you have to work with. This is no different than, like many other industries. And so we are now a power limited industry. Our revenues will associate with that. Well, based on that, you want to make sure you have the most energy efficient compute architecture you can possibly get.
So again, this highlights why we have this discussion. We're talking about power because power happens to be the limiting factor of the development of all this AI infrastructure and data centers and digital economy and so on. Everyone is limited by power. So power is definitely the most important thing if you want to be serious about developing infrastructure within the digital economy space. And nobody has enough power. That's the sad reality of our world today. Nobody has enough power. Let me show you a proof of that. Look at this. This is posted March 27, about 10 days ago, 12 days ago. So look at this. When OpenAI released their newest image generation engine, the one that everybody was posting cartoons online about, Sam Altman was complaining that our GPUs are melting. That means that the GPUs were burning so much power, and he had to actually put a limit to how many generations you get per day. So the free customers would only get 3 per day because GPUs are melting. When he says GPUs are melting, he's saying that I'm paying too much for electricity, because essentially the electricity that he needs to actually run the GPUs has to come from a provider. And that means that his cost is going to ramp up. So the point here is that he's managing his cost by saying we're limiting uses. He's managing his cost because the GPUs are running over time and burning too much power. And that means that his costs are running out. That's the reality of the business. The business is based on GPUs. This is a very bad joke, but unfortunately it's real. Back in March 18th, NVIDIA released the next generation, which is going to be available in the second half of 2027. A single rack will consume 600 kilowatts. Now, it's really unclear how anybody can come up with so much energy. The only thing we can have to think about is renewable energy sources. And towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about nuclear, because these are the only sources that can give us these insane figures. With that, you understand we have a problem. I established the basic baseline. Everybody's trying to figure out how to actually satisfy the appetite of the GPUs. Nobody has a ready solution except to develop new energy sources. So let's look at some figures. The next section is full of charts. I'm going to jump between them. I don't want to bore you with too many charts. However, when you get a copy of the presentation, you'll get all the charts as well as all the sources I used in my research to build this deck. So the fact that I'm going to jump a slide or two doesn't mean that you will not get access to them or the supporting research. I'm just cognizant of the time, and we need to cover as much material as possible. So let's size the problem now. So this comes from KKR. So those of us who are old in the internet business remember the internet 1.0 era. This is the beginning of the internet. This is the dawn of the internet. And the period was from 1999 to 2006. Investment firm KKR's estimate that the total power infrastructure requirements for that period was around 2 gigawatts. So all the energy requirements globally were around 2 gigawatts. And then we go into Internet 2.0. This is the period where we saw the cloud platforms, the streaming platforms, everything that we become accustomed to. This is in the period 06 to 22, and this was an 8 gigawatt opportunity. Now, you probably can guess where I'm going with this. This is what the nightmare that we're looking at. For AI and high-performance computing, this is going to be a 30 gigawatt opportunity, but look at the time frame. This is like 16, 17 years. This is like what, 12, 13 years. This is only 5, 6 years. So we're going to need 4 times more the energy that we needed to develop all the cloud platforms and all the streaming platforms and so on, but we're going to need it in 6 times. So that's 6 years. That's half the time. So that tells you that we're facing a very unique challenge globally. We need to come up with so much energy to satisfy the requirement of these massive AI systems. This is an interesting statistic. This is from the US, and if anybody's asking what the US, because the US is the largest country that has data centers, as I showed you in the first infographic, and the projection is the data center power consumption is going to double or triple by 2028. Here's a question for you to think about. Do you know any other industry that's going to double or triple in the next 4 years? Probably no. So this is a very unique industry globally. Airlines, tourism, petrochemicals, agriculture, nobody has this projection in terms of double. This comes from the US. This is about energy in the US, and 40 years of energy as captured in this slide. In this period, you had growth because of, you had more PCs, more computers, more equipment. So digitalization drove up the consumption of power. This in the US, this is measured in thousands of terawatt hours. So between 1990 and 2000 in the US, it was a good point to be an investor in energy because you had increasing demand. Here, the demand started to flatten a little bit because of the energy efficiency wave that swept the industry. So the growth was dampened a little bit by that energy efficiency. And here comes the dark period. This period is flat. By the way, here you can see a 2008 economic crash, the crisis. So you see a dip there. But in this period, actually, all the way between 2020 and 2023, the curve is almost flat. Essentially, you're ending the decade where you started. That means that investors were not really keen on putting any more dollars in power generation infrastructure because there was no demand for it. And boom, look at what happened here. 2022, 2023, then AI, and then everybody's racing to generate more power. Okay, if you want some figures, the growth factor here was 2% annually. Here it was a 1% because of the energy efficiency. Here it's practically zero. It's a flat curve, more or less. But here we're looking at 4%. This is the compound annual growth rate for energy. So now money is flowing back into energy. More people are investing in energy because there is demand for it. Of course, in the US, especially under the current president, everybody's concerned about the carbon footprint objectives because people are going to say, you know what, I need power. I don't care about sustainability and so on. That's a concern that many people in the US have right now. But that's the US energy sector in one slide over 40 years. Again, we're focusing on data centers. And this is the consumption of data centers in terawatt hours between starting 2014. Up until here, things were sort of nice and easy. A maximum 4.4. So that means that 4.4% of the total energy in the US were consumed by data centers. And then boom, the projections indicate that by 2028, you're going to be consuming in terms of data centers in the US between 6.7% and 12%. So you can immediately see that the jump came around here, which is the ChatGPT launch date and so on. So you can see AI has a massive impact on the energy and the power consumption in the US. A nice study, again, same logic. These people are trying to estimate, this is the Electric Power Research Institute. They're trying to estimate the growth factor for data centers. In this case, they had 4 scenarios: low growth, moderate growth, high growth, and higher growth. And they're trying to estimate how much percent of the 2030 electricity consumption will be consumed by data centers. And you see the figures between 4.6% and 9.1%. The US is an extreme case globally. Most countries will not be near these figures. So you have no reason to be concerned about consumption of data centers out of your national grid because you do not have the same level of massive infrastructure of the US. Still, it is an interesting point to study. I'm going to show you, this slide is scary. If you don't see it scary, let me show you how scary it is. So this is done by McKinsey. This was done September last year. And this is, again, the energy consumption in terawatt hours of data centers across the period from 2023 to 2030. It looks nice, but then you consider the growth rate. So McKinsey estimates that the growth rate is 22.3%. What does that mean? It means that data center power consumption doubles every 40 months. So you went from 147 to 292. That's the first doubling. And then you went from 292 to over 600. There is not a single industry on the planet that doubles every 40 months. Nothing doubles every 40 months. Of course, this is not sustainable. I mean, if we extend this towards 2040, nobody expects it to be double every 40 months. But for now, this seems to be the consensus of the industry. Same information, I'm going to jump it. This is a nice slide. These are the 4 scenarios I showed you in a second. The higher growth, high growth, moderate, and low growth. And this is the McKinsey study. This is a Goldman Sachs study. So what this bar graph shows us is that this is the baseline starting from the 2023 year consumption, and you're trying to estimate by 2030 how much growth will happen. And the figure here tells you how much percentage of the total US electricity consumption in 2030 is going to be consumed by data centers. So again, for the study I showed you, it's between 4.6 and 9.1. McKinsey is very bullish. It's going to be between 11 and 12%. And this is the 606 terawatt hours I showed you. So the moral of the story here is that we expect explosive growth in data center consumption in the US as well as globally. I'm going to show you a global slide. This is a global slide by McKinsey. Focus on AI. So look at this. So McKinsey estimates that generative AI workload, the stuff that we use, ChatGPT and all the other stuff, is growing at an annual growth rate of 39%. 39% annually. These are insane figures. The other workloads, which is the cloud and all the other infrastructure, is growing at 16% annually. So on average, you have a total growth rate of blended 22%. This is the 22 figure I showed you about. So you understand now the US is facing a situation that no other country on the planet is facing. They need to figure out where to come up with that energy, and need to come up with that energy fast if the US is to maintain leadership of the global AI race against China and Europe. I'm going to jump to a global perspective now, and we're nearing the closure of the chart, so bear with me, please. I know this is not the nicest thing to look at, but it's unfortunately very necessary for you to understand the crisis that we globally look at. This is global, so this is the International Energy Agency estimate, and this is IDC study. And you can see that globally, by 2030, the situation is not as extreme as the US. I mean, we expect here in this case to be consuming 3% of the total electricity consumption to data centers. This one we estimate 13%, and so on. So you get the idea that there's going to be tremendous growth, but it's not as extreme as the US. And for comparison, I'm going to show you something that actually puts these things in a better context. This is the same study. So this is 2030. And we're looking at a pie chart of data of the different uses of energy. As you can see, data centers is a tiny sliver, tiny slice of the pie. Compare it with space cooling, which is the AC, or space heating, which is the heating systems used in cold countries like Europe and so on. Heavy industry, electric vehicles. And all of a sudden you get the notion that data centers are not that beast. If you read online, people tell you that data centers are going to swallow electricity, they can actually put people out of business. That's not the case in terms of energy, because if you run the analysis properly, you see that globally, it's not going to be that significant compared to cooling or heating or other energy uses. So that tells you that data centers will have massive growth, but they will not be a dominant factor as opposed to other energy uses. The last thing we're going to show you is the value chain or the supply chain of energy. We keep talking about energy in terms of generation, but energy needs to be delivered into a data center via a combination of infrastructure assets. You need to have the medium voltage, which connects with the grid, low voltage for distribution within the building, backup power, uninterruptible power supply or UPSs, and so on. So what happens to the supply chain if no energy is available? You guessed it, more constraints. This showed you that it used to be around between 6 and 10 months lead time of, if you're going to order a generator in 2019, now you have to wait between 10 and 60. All the blue bars there is the extended delays or lead times for ordering all these different kinds of equipment. Why? Because manufacturers of electrical equipment cannot manufacture them quickly enough. So everybody's compressed. Not only power generation utilities are compressed, but even companies who manufacture switchgear, transformers, distribution panels, everybody's squeezed. So now let's go into the part of the presentation that's going to actually tie it all up for you in a bundle so that we can link what we discussed the last session about politics and this one, and sort of try to actually put some intelligence at your hands. The next slide comes from Mr. Macron, who happens to be visiting Egypt these days, the French president. And this is a very nice clip. I need you to listen to that clip carefully because it shows what a head of state in this time of intense international competition is talking about for his country and how he's planning to put his country first.
This is how to have much more data centers. And we are back in the race now. Why? Because in order to do so, you need chips. We start to accelerate the program. France is part of the European countries manufacturing chips. We will build new partnerships with American and Asian players in order to manufacture more chips and secure our capacities. You need available spaces and energy. And here I want to showcase what is a great advantage of France. We have available land. We work very hard with the local authorities, and I want to thank the regions present here. We identified 35 sites available. And the most important for me, we have low carbon pilotable available energy. And this is unique if you compare with the rest of the world. Because we have a model of production based on nuclear energy, which means that more than 75% of our electricity is produced by this nuclear energy. It's pilotable, it's low carbon, and we produce more than what we use. Last year, we exported 90 terawatt hour, 90, which means we can localize a lot of data centers on top of what we need in terms of electricity for our own companies, our own households. So it's very important in this world where I have a good friend in the other part of the ocean saying, drill, baby, drill. Here, there is no need to drill. It's just plug, baby, plug. Electricity is available. You can plug, it's ready.
Now, I don't care how cool you think you are. You will never be as cool as Mr. Macron saying, plug, baby, plug. But, you know, the point here is that energy is a presidential discussion point. Presidents of countries are now discussing how to get energy to satisfy the requirements for their own digital infrastructure. And France is not an exception. You see it around the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, of course, in the US and President Trump, in the UK and so on. Energy is a critical point that it requires presidential engagement to facilitate and try to develop strategies for. This highlights the energy dilemma in Europe. This is this report just came out, by the way. It's March 17th. This is in the middle of 2024. The three colors you see are the different prices for energy across Europe. So the blue ones, which is the Nordics and France and Spain and Portugal, is the lowest cost of energy, more or less, in Europe. And then you have the bulk of Europe is yellow, and then Eastern Europe is extremely expensive. What does that mean? That there is a room for energy arbitrage in Europe. And although Europe acts as one, of course, the UK exited, it's not really one in terms of energy. There is huge disparity in energy prices, and that leads to all sorts of interesting opportunities. This is the electricity prices in Europe per non-household for industrial uses and data centers. And I need you to actually consider this. This is why the Nordics is so successful in data center development, because the energy prices is so low compared to other parts of Europe. And of course, the other part is the environment. It's very cold in the Nordics in winter. So practically you get between 90 and 100 days a year that you hardly use your cooling system. The second interesting point about this slide is Ireland. Ireland is a very interesting point. Remember, I told you about the FLAP D at the beginning of the presentation. Dublin is one of the key markets in Europe, but you wouldn't conclude this from looking at this because Ireland is expensive. What the Irish managed to do is that although they have expensive energy, they have a very favorable tax regime and they have a very business-friendly environment for attracting these kinds of infrastructure. They have a very well-educated workforce. So Ireland managed to actually attract investment in data center, although the energy prices are some of the highest in Europe. What does that tell us? Not every player can be Messi, but you can actually figure out a way to play football and make a name for yourself without being this perfect player, Lionel Messi. Same thing, Ireland, the Nordics, everybody's trying to play with the advantages they have, and there is room for all sorts of strategies here. You don't have to be the cheapest to compete. This is interesting. I don't think many people realize how many projects in power are going internationally, but this one is really interesting. UK doesn't have any meaningful solar generation. UK is the energy, the weather and the climate in the UK is really bad in terms of sun. So the UK is purchasing power from Morocco. So they're building this massive cable, 3,800 kilometer cable from Morocco, where Morocco has a lot of solar energy and wind energy. And they're going to build this cable to connect it to the UK to power up data centers and other industrial uses there. This is almost a $30 billion investment. And the amount of energy is massive. And the length of the cable is massive. And this is something that looked like science fiction at the beginning. You can't imagine that a country like UK is purchasing power from Morocco. But this is how extreme the power requirements are, and people need energy no matter what. Here is another example. This is Singapore and Australia. Singapore is a very tiny country. There is not a lot of space there. There is not a lot of resources to generate energy. So they're buying energy through this cable from Australia. Again, they're paying $20 billion investment to have this cable, which is 4,300 kilometers, to get power from Australia to power up data centers there. This is called the Sun Cable project. These are insane projects, very expensive, but this is what the crisis we're facing is forcing people to do. This is interesting. Microsoft just signed last year a $1 billion investment for a data center in Kenya, but here's the game plan. This is why Microsoft is such a dangerous company, and they're the smartest people on the planet. I don't care what anybody says. Microsoft are the most dangerous company compared to Google and Amazon and so on. So what Microsoft is doing is that they have this fantastic tool called the global scheduler. And what does that allow them to do is that they have data centers in different parts of the world, and the cost of energy in these places are different depending on the geothermal or solar or wind and so on. So what this global scheduler allows them to do is that they send AI workloads to the cheapest energy source first. Let me give an example. If you are BMW and you're renting from Microsoft 3,000 servers to process the design for the next 7 series. So Microsoft takes the business from you and sell you the server at a certain, let's say $10 per hour. The rate is fixed. But then in terms of cost of delivery, they can ship the AI workload to where the power is cheapest. So Kenya, Middle East, Far East, whatever it is. So they're able to optimize in real time the utilization of their global infrastructure to minimize the cost and maximize the profit. This is what the power crisis allows people to play with. I'm not going to talk about renewable energy today because the presentation is too heavy already. I'm going to lump it under the sustainability or the planet aspect next episode. But I do need to give you some information about the nuclear power solutions because there is a lot of misconceptions about it. This is a very interesting quote. You cannot win in AI without nuclear. So nuclear is not something that is exotic or rare. Nuclear is going to be the power horse of the industry, whether you like it or not. So just that some countries are far ahead of others on the curve, but in nuclear is going to happen. I'm going to tell you how it's going to happen. These are interesting news from October and September last year about major players like Google and Microsoft signing nuclear power purchase agreements with generators. So you can already clearly understand this is going to be very, very important for these companies who are committing to purchase these amounts of power. What I need you to understand that there are 3 categories of nuclear reactors. There is the traditional one. In Egypt, by the way, we're building one in Dab'a. So this is the traditional nuclear reactors that you have in mind. But then you have something called SMRs and microreactors. And always make sure that you understand whenever you read an article or listen to a video if they're talking about microreactors or SMRs or traditional reactors. This is a typical example from Rolls-Royce. They have an SMR that can output 470 megawatts. It's the size of only 2 football fields. This is a very interesting development. This is also an interesting development. Look at this. This tube, which is 23 meters by 4.5 meters, can generate 77 megawatts. And you need to refuel with refrigerant fuel every 21 months. So companies like NuScale and Rolls-Royce and so on are really innovative in terms of their designs of new, very space-efficient nuclear reactors. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about microreactors because this is the hottest part of the industry. So microreactors provide a number of benefits. They provide clean energy. They are versatile. They can be deployed very rapidly. They have mobility aspects, and they're modular. Microreactors provide anywhere between 5 and 20 megawatt of energy, which satisfies many data center requirements. Very interesting developments there. I just want to highlight this. Westinghouse has a model of microreactor that can generate 5 megawatts, and it has over 8 years of refueling cycle. That means that you only have to refuel this microreactor once every 8 years, and then it gives you energy based on that. Very few energy sources can compete with this option. It's very versatile, very modular, very robust. Of course, the way forward, there is a lot of certification, a lot of inspection, security inspection, and safety inspection that has to happen before these things are deployed. But here's the good news. We already know how to make these things. The US Navy has been running nuclear power submarines since 1954. We already know how to make very small microreactors. We just need to this is 70 years ago, by the way. So for 70 years, we have companies and contractors and engineers and project managers who are very proficient in generation after generation of developing these small size reactors. All you have to do now is just get it out of a submarine, put it in a different enclosure, and figure out a way to deploy it in a basement of a building or in a campus to power up data centers. This is what a modern nuclear microreactor looks like. Just fits on the container on the back of a truck, and you can haul it to wherever it's needed. And it's self-contained, it's safe, and so on. And the amount of energy is huge. Now, Mr. Elon Musk talks about colonizing space, and here's another reason why nuclear energy is important, because you need these things on Mars, because Mars, you do not have an atmosphere to get you wind. You cannot run a wind turbine on Mars. And solar is also questionable on Mars. So another reason why people are investing in nuclear microreactors and these kinds of infrastructure is that besides meeting the requirements of data centers, you will need them when you go to had a base on the moon or maybe colonize Mars. This is a demo last 2 years ago by Rolls-Royce.
Safe, reliable, and emission-free power. New nuclear thinking. Rolls-Royce and the UKSA are developing novel, clean energy technologies, a versatile next-generation microreactor, scalable with multi-domain applicability. The microreactor uses an inherently safe and robust fuel form able to withstand the most extreme conditions. A graphite core structure constrains the fuel particles and transfers the heat away from the fuel to the power conversion system. Innovative heat exchanger technology enables the microreactor to be as efficient and lightweight as possible, vital for use in space. Here, the heat from the core is converted into electricity. The science and innovation of the microreactor offers endless opportunities. Because when the power to deliver and the power to explore combine, new horizons are reached. The potential of a clean, long-term power source on the moon, reliably, flexibly, and sustainably supporting a range of operational demands, providing power and heat output as required. Powering new journeys, new connections, new understandings, new discovery. Rolls-Royce Microreactor, the power to explore.
this small unit outputs 50 megawatt of capacity. So you already can feel that this thing is moving forward very quickly. This is a two bits of news that I wanted to highlight to you. This is March 28th, about 10 days ago. $900 million of investment is being made by the Department of Energy in the US to deploy SMRs. And in Canada, our friends in Canada, this is last Friday. Okay, they issued an SMR construction license. So when people talk about nuclear, they talk about it as if it's something that is like science fiction or something that is just imaginary. No, nuclear energy is having a renaissance now, and these packages and new form factors will allow everyone to use nuclear energy in a safe way. Of course, we have to pass through a safety inspection and certification process. And practically speaking, in terms of timeline, this is not going to be available before 2023, 2035. Because you need to go through all this massive amount of certification and security inspection for deployment in a situation where you have a nuclear microreactor in the basement of an office building or a data center in downtown Cairo, for example. Now, I'm finished with the presentation. I'll just going to leave you with a couple of closing remarks to wrap the whole thing together for you, and then we can open for questions. I do apologize. The material is a little bit heavy, but power is such an integral part of the digital infrastructure development cycle that it needed to be adequately covered. When you get the presentation, you'll have all the material that you need to do your own research. But I just need to give you my parting thoughts before I open the floor for discussion. The first one is that there is a war ongoing. Whether you realize it or not, there is a war ongoing. It's not only USA versus China, it's every country in the world trying to make sure that it does not get taken advantage of. And you need to have their own infrastructure to run the applications and the systems they need for economic value creation. The second point is that energy is not really about energy. It's not only about power, it's about sovereignty. Look at the examples of Singapore and Australia or the UK and Morocco. You know, if you cannot figure out enough energy to what you need, whether your own resources or you buy it from someone else, then your sovereignty is going to be at risk. Countries who do not have enough energy to run digital infrastructure within their own borders will have an issue maintaining their sovereignty because they're going to be, unfortunately, sort of slaved to someone else who's providing them the infrastructure they need. So talking about energy is talking about the digital economy and also talking about the sovereignty and economic growth prospects of countries. Now, this is the summary. If you have power, then you have power. What does that mean? Well, if you have energy, if you have electrical energy, that gives you leverage. Australia got a lot of concessions from Singapore in order to agree to give it energy. Morocco got a lot of cooperation from the UK on multiple tracks, industrial, agricultural, tourism, in order to actually cooperate in energy. If you have power, that means that you have more energy resources, like France, for example, bragging about having exported 90 terawatt hours. If you have energy resources, then that gives you some political maneuvering and cards to play with. Countries in the Middle East, including Egypt and some countries in Africa as well, do have energy resources to play the game internationally. But this is what I want you to understand. Energy is about sovereignty. It's about playing a political game. It's about protecting your economic growth process for your people. This cannot be complete without a comment on Egypt. The puzzle in Egypt is really interesting. There is a lot to gain, a lot to stake. The point is that the puzzle pieces are really not aligned yet. We need a lot of effort from all stakeholders so that the puzzle is solved like this. But I'm really enthusiastic about the future of Egypt and digital infrastructure. We just need to actually have a plan because there doesn't seem to be a consensus about the direction we're moving into as far as the development of these things. This is the scary scene I like the most about Interstellar. If you remember the movie, these are not mountains, they're waves. This is what you should feel about the digital infrastructure wave coming towards us. It's like a mountain or like a huge object moving towards you very quickly. And it requires infrastructure, it requires energy, and you need to plan for it. Otherwise, you're going to be swept by this wave. If you're a small country, you're going to unfortunately be swept by this and you're going to find yourself sort of buying infrastructure services from someone else because they developed it and you didn't. Another scary statistic for you. This whole thing only materialized because of ChatGPT. Remember, ChatGPT was launched November 30th, 2022. That's less than 1,000 days ago. All this talk about digital infrastructure and energy and politics and planet and sustainability and data center and AI and power and processors and GPUs, all this only started less than 1,000 days ago. This is a very scary thought because things are moving at an insanely quick rate and we need to have a plan. Every country on the planet needs to have a plan. It doesn't have to be a perfect plan, but you do need to have a plan because that is what you require. We're all running out of time because this thing is moving too fast. So there is nothing more I can say except that whether you have a company to run, whether you advise a government official, whether you are a part of an expert group somewhere, or whether you're a consultant, please make sure that people understand the urgency because these things are moving at a rate that we have never seen before. And with that, I close my presentation. I thank you for listening, and we open it up for Q&A.
Yes, I see a couple of, I see someone from Nigeria, has a question. Can you read it, Ahmed?
Yeah, sure. I'm reading the question now from
Yeah.
Nigeria. I just want to ask this question. I see you display Nigeria rate of consumption is 29 kilowatt per kilowatt hour. Does that mean that AI servers have their spec? Well, if I understand the question properly is how can such a high consumption or high energy consumption rate for GPUs be sustained in Nigeria? Well, you're not alone, my friend. I mean, in Egypt as well as most parts of Africa, for that matter, Kenya as well, and even South Africa. Nobody really has that amount of energy lying around waiting for a data center to be built and supplied. So you're correct in identifying that this is a challenge. We have the same challenge in Egypt, and that's why renewable energy and nuclear energy is a very interesting prospect to explore. So if you are serious about developing infrastructure, the first place to start, where is it that we're going to actually generate the power I need to power those data centers? And regardless of whether you have solar or wind or geothermal or nuclear, you have to actually put together a plan because that's the first block. Because once you have power, then you can actually move into the development of the data centers and talk about AI and so on. There are other challenges, by the way, in the AI space, including buying processors, especially American-made processors, is really difficult right now because there is limitations on international customers buying NVIDIA and AMD chips. So that's another challenge. But if you sort the power channels, at least you can buy Chinese chips or Korean chips or Indian chips and so on. But energy in Nigeria and in Egypt and in Kenya and almost all the Morocco and all the other African countries remains a challenge to be solved. And it requires the cooperation not only of the Energy Ministry or the Electricity Ministry, the Ministry of Digital Infrastructure, the Ministry of Economic Development, the Ministry of International Cooperation. Everyone needs to cooperate to develop this. I think I addressed the question. Anybody else has a question, another comment?
Yes. Okay. So I like the Macron part. So I like when he said that France has identified 35 locations or sites, and they have a plan, as you were saying, and they have their own competencies to do this. And also when you said the Morocco, UK, or Singapore, Australia project, the undersea cables transporting the energy. Have Egypt or a collaborative effort in Africa, do we have something of the sort, something similar that we have identified? We have a strategy for that, maybe as African nations, or whether for the electricity part or for hosting data centers on our land? Because I think Africa, and maybe North Africa, has a lot of competencies already in terms of space, energy, everything. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
You're absolutely correct. North Africa does have a lot of potential because we have a very well-educated workforce and we have a lot of land that we can actually build these massive infrastructure projects on. The problem, which is the first part of your question, is that energy, we still all challenge in energy because the traditional energy sources that we have in our countries were not designed for these kinds of massive loads. They're designed for industrial or residential uses. So essentially what we have to do right now is to go back to the drawing board and figure out how can we accelerate the development of new renewable energy projects to meet the demand for these projects. The good news is that Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and most of Africa actually has a lot of renewable energy potential to play too. So that's the good news. The bad news is that we need investment, we need technical expertise, and that requires a lot of coordination. So that's the first part. There are the ingredients of a fantastic meal, but we don't have a chef in the kitchen yet to cook the meal for us. The second part is, are we cooperating regionally for power generation projects? Not to my knowledge. Morocco is doing its own thing. Kenya is doing its own thing with geothermal, because Kenya is lucky to have geothermal energy. Egypt is doing its own thing. There was talk about 2 years ago about a power cable between Egypt and Greece to be developed. I'm not up to speed on that project. My understanding, it didn't happen. But the point is that we're not really developing these Pan-African power networks yet. We might be able to do it if we can show that, similar to France's situation, being able to export so much energy because we have nuclear. A country like Egypt can be in a position to export so much energy using solar or wind, for example. And then we can go to countries like Tunisia or Sudan or Mali or Chad and tell them, hey, if you want to develop data centers, take the power from me. We'll develop not a submarine cable, we'll develop a terrestrial cable underground or other kinds of cables to give you energy. So there is potential to play this role regionally, but again, it's not clear that people are paying attention to it yet, and not all countries are prioritizing these kinds of investments because they do not see the full potential about the digital infrastructure and its effect on their economies.
Thank you. So if I can follow up again. So Macron, when he was saying in his quote, he said, our own companies and people. So he was speaking in the Global AI Summit, but he was still speaking about France and French companies and serving the French people. This is strange, although because of the nature of the business, you might as well also need to have it to host on your land and make money out of international organizations and companies. But the second thing also, I wanted to get your insights on when the NVIDIA CEO, Jensen, was saying it's impossible to go without nuclear. Why is he so sure? Isn't all this is about innovation and things are shifting and changing all the time? Thank you.
Because the energy potential of nuclear is unlimited compared to any other energy source. There was a slide, in one of the slides we said that 1 kilogram of uranium can generate 24 gigawatt of power. You don't have the same level of efficiency. Solar, for example, burns so much land because you need to lay down these solar panels. And solar panels, even the best top-of-the-line ones, have a 30% efficiency rate. That means that 30% only of the energy that comes from the sun and hits the surface of the panel gets transferred to electricity. 70%, and this is cutting-edge stuff. This is the latest 2024 to 2025 panels from China. So compared to that, nuclear is very efficient, very modular, very space conservative, and you can get a lot of it. And so in terms of maintenance as well, you refuel these things every 2-3 years, in some cases 8 years. So that's what he said. There is no other energy source that can compete with nuclear on those aspects. And of course, it still maintains the clean energy mandate because there is not a lot of, CO2 emissions from it. Although in the case of nuclear, there is spent fuel that requires careful disposition of because they have nuclear waste. But again, it shares that zero CO2 emission with solar and with wind and with geothermal. So that's where Jensen Huang is coming from. He looks around and there is no other energy source that can compete at the same level of efficiency with nuclear. And that's why the US and Canada and the UK, you saw Rolls-Royce and so on, are betting so big on it because they understand that long term, while solar and wind and geothermal can play a role, the ultimate solution has to be widespread use of nuclear. I'm looking at the chat again. I hope I answered your question, Mariam. If not, let me know.
Very well, thank you.
Mr. Abdel-Fattah saying, how can I access the previous session recordings, including this one? Well, my understanding, everyone who registered for this session will get emailed a link to this recording. And then if you reply to that email, we can send you the recordings for the previous sessions. And also you can find them, I think, online on the YouTube channel for ISOC. Mariam, correct me if I'm wrong before I move to Yasmin's question,
correctly.
please.
Yes, and please communicate with us on Internet Master page on LinkedIn. We will put the link for that as well. It might be easy as well. Yes.
Okay.
And
So now I have a
Internet
question.
Society posted, and they have a live channel, so you will find it.
Okay. Oh, somebody posted already. Thank you for that.
Thank you,
Julie posted part 1 and part 2. Okay. So Abdel Fattah, you can find the links in the chat for part 1 and part 2. I'll address Yasmin's question now. Yasmin from Vodafone Egypt. And her question is that I believe that in Egypt we have the land and the energy sources, but unfortunately we are still behind in the data center race, correct? Do you think we are out of the race, or we still have an opportunity to catch up? Also, what would be the best strategy to start? Okay, that's a two-part question. Let's address the first one. Are we out of the race? No, we're not out of the race, but we're really, really behind. You're not out of the race until the race is over. So the race is not over yet. There is no clear number 1 and number 2, although we can say that there are front runners and there are laggards like Egypt. And the reason for that is that we still have not, as a society, as a community, this is not a technical discussion. This is about economy that touches every one of us. As a society, we have not really given this its rightful place in our priorities. We still view data centers as something that the Minister of Telecommunication or the NTRA, the regulator, or a couple of investors should worry about. It's not something that we really should not concern ourselves about as a community as a whole or as a country, because it's not really that important. Once that view changes, similar to what happened in UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Kenya, and Morocco, when people said, wait a minute, this is too big of an opportunity to miss, let's put our heads together. And you have a cabinet, many councils, and you have coordination mechanisms, and you have accountabilities, and you have KPIs. Once that happens, then all the resources you refer to in terms of energy and land in Egypt would be put to good use. So far, this is not happening because it's not really a priority, and it's not something that is being tracked as a key KPI for the government in terms of digital economy development and so on. It's not high yet. It's not visible yet. Also, what would be a best strategy to start? Well, again, the best strategy is something that's an open-ended question. Every country plays the game differently. Kenya plays with geothermal energy. Morocco plays with solar, and Morocco decided to export energy. We may decide to actually not to export energy, but to actually figure out a way to build these massive data centers. But then we have to figure out what kind of land to give them at what price. What's the price of energy we're going to charge these data centers? What kind of investment incentives we need to offer them? And also what kind of mandates that we can relax. For example, security in Egypt is always a concern for investment, because there is a lot of requirements if you are running a data center that you have to comply with. And if you're running in a race, you don't want these kinds of extreme requirements hampering your movement. So also we need to be very proactive and try to actually offer something that makes sense for investors and not actually burden them with so much requirements for security and so on. A middle ground solution is needed by all the stakeholders. This is not something that concerns only the technology team. This concerns all the teams of the government, and they need to actually work together to support investment and support a strategic competitive advantage of Egypt, which I personally think Egypt is really entitled to, but we have a lot of work to do. You're welcome. 10 جنيه بس. Mariam, back to you. I think we covered, there's a question on the chat again. How effective are nuclear regulatory frameworks in African countries? And do they provide a stable, transparent environment to attract and retain investors in the future? The short answer, according to my limited knowledge, is no. I'm not aware of a mature regulatory framework in any African country for that kind of investment. Again, we're talking about these micro reactors and small modular reactors. We're not talking about the large reactors, because in a country like Egypt, for example, we have been building one on the north coast for the last 4 years. It's going to come online in, I think, 3 years, if I'm not mistaken. But the point is that this is the traditional nuclear reactor, the one that, for example, was in Fukushima in 2011 that had this incident at Fukushima Daiichi. To your question, I don't think African countries have developed nuclear regulators similar to telecom regulators. When that happens, they will be able to actually issue licenses, and there will actually be investment opportunities. There's going to be inspection bodies and so on. For now, I don't think it's a priority for most countries. And again, this is for good reason. If you are Kenya, for example, you have geothermal. So you feel that you have enough energy to satisfy the demand that you need. So you don't really need to go all the way into nuclear. Other countries in Europe or America or Asia Pacific feel the need for nuclear much more because they're running out of development potential for traditional renewable sources. So in Africa, it's a long way. I do not expect African countries to develop these kinds of projects anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that they cannot play the game. They can play the game using wind or solar or geothermal. And definitely we have shown examples like Morocco that you can have a credible strategy using what you have. You don't have to play the game like the Americans or the Europeans play it. You can play to your own strength, but ultimately big picture and long term, nuclear is going to be the workhorse of the global industry. Companies like Google or Microsoft or Amazon or OpenAI will definitely have to rely on nuclear. For our countries in the Middle East and Africa region, we have other options that probably can be more accessible and more cheaper for us to develop.
Well, we thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you on the upcoming session, which I think is going to be next month in May, right, Ahmed, or would you like to have it earlier?
Well, again, this one should have happened 3 weeks ago, but we had to postpone it because of a sort of a very important event in Egypt. We're not going to get into that right now. But the point is that definitely let's do the follow-up one, which is going to be the planet, because I need to cover the renewable energy aspect, which I did not get a chance today to cover it. I only covered nuclear. So let's do something in May. Let's say the first or 10 days of May should be a target date. This allows everyone to sort of digest the information. And we can gather again in May, and hopefully we should be able to close the session with the people aspect sometime in June. And then based on all the 5 sessions, we can determine what do we do next in terms of maybe a panel discussion with multiple speakers, Q&A sessions, and so on. But my intention is to do the next one in the first 10 days of May, and I hope that's okay with everyone on the call.
I'm sure everybody will be interested to participate in the new ones. And yes, as you said, I think we will conclude. It will be very nice if after we finish the people, we can do an open discussion. Maybe either we organize it with speakers, or we have like an open mic session for an hour where everybody to contribute, and there will be a back and forth discussion. So I think this would be also a good option. We'll investigate that and we'll come back to everybody. But thank you everyone for participating, and thank you for your questions. Thank you, Ahmed, very much for your insights and all the valuable information you've been sharing. I took a lot of notes. I have multiple follow-up questions, but I think we have to leave now with 7:30. So Cairo
okay,
time. So,
understood. The only action item is the presentation. So I'll make the presentation available via a link. I'll share it with Mariam and the Internet Masr team. And then I think that will be a mail to everyone. So you'll get a link to download the presentation, and then you have all the material. That's the only action item from the call.
Yes, please. Yes, thank you very much. But it was amazing. And I think we have a lot of takeaways from today's. But thank you very much.
Alhamdulillah.
Thank you, everyone. Yes. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Take care.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao.